Good afternoon, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferrier, the Archivist of the United States, and I'm pleased you could join us for this afternoon's program, whether you're here in the theater or joining us through Facebook or YouTube. Before we hear from today's speaker, though, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up here in the McGowan Theater. On Tuesday, February 18th at noon, we'll hear from investigative journalist Jerry Mitchell. With his new book, Race Against Time, a reporter reopens the unsolved murder cases of the civil rights era. Mitchell's work played a central role in bringing killers to justice for the assassination of Medgar Evers, the firebombing of Vernon Dahmer, the 16th Street Church bombing in Birmingham, and the Mississippi burning case. And on Tuesday, February 25th at noon, Fergus Bordowich will be here with his book, Congress at War, How Republican Reformers Fought the Civil War, Defied Lincoln, Ended Slavery, and Remade America. This new book describes the lasting changes enacted by the Republican Party during the Civil War and Reconstruction. To keep informed about these events and other events throughout the year, check our website, archives.gov, or sign up at the table outside to get email updates. Another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. You can check out their website, archivesfoundation.org, for more information. In recent decades, it's become standard practice for departing presidents to sign book deals as they leave the Oval Office. Craig Fehrman informs us, an author-in-chief, the untold story of our presidents and the books they wrote, that the campaign biography or post-presidency memoir has roots in the early days of our republic. Those same years from our nation's beginning into the 21st century are documented in the records we preserve here at the National Archives, and those who do research in those records know the importance of learning about historical figures from their own words. Through online tools such as Founders Online, which is supported by our National Historical Publications and Records Commission here at the National Archives, we can read the words of our first 5 presidents and other founders. And in the 14 presidential libraries run by the National Archives and Records Administration, we encounter the works of presidents since Herbert Hoover, which Craig relied on in his research. That we have these writings after hundreds of years demonstrates the meaning of the National Archives motto, "The written word endures." And everyday research and authors remind us of the value of the records we preserve. I'm pleased now to turn you over to Craig Fehrman to hear about what Wall Street Journal reviewer Thomas Malin called one of the best books on the American presidency to appear in recent years, and a delightfully instructive new study of presidential authorship. Craig Fehrman is a native of Indiana, a graduate at the University of Southern Indiana, and attended Yale University. He is a journalist, historian who has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, among others, and appeared on NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Craig Fehrman.
Hi, everybody. While we're waiting for my images to come up on the screen, I'm going to take this opportunity to say hi to Henry and Maisie, who are my 2 little kids who are watching on YouTube. I'm really glad that that's going to be on there. And to my wife, Candace, who's probably trying to keep them from eating a remote or something like that. But I love you guys, and I hope you enjoy what I'm going to talk about. I hope you all enjoy what I'm going to talk about, too. My book really has a lot of behind-the-scenes stories about books. You know, we can learn something from a president about a book they wrote, but we can also learn something from going behind the scenes. So what I thought I would do today is take you behind the scenes for my book, tell you how I came to write it, what kind of research I did, and what I learned. But there's one question I would like you to keep in mind. It's kind of a bigger question, and I'll refer to it a couple times, and that's just, how personal is history? Is history personal? Is it not? It's just a question that I'd like you to think about, kind of a theme for what we'll talk about today. This image here is a picture of Charles Dickens in 1867 talking about one of his books in the United States. And it's a nice reminder, I think, that everything has a history, even what we're doing here today. Before I go any further, I would also like to thank the National Archives for hosting us, for preserving so many of these documents that I relied on in my own research. And I just think there's something special about people who preserve history, people like you all who love history. This is the United States National Museum. The names have changed a lot since then, but in 1891. And what that is up there is that's the relics of George Washington. And what I love about history lovers is that that doesn't feel 130 years old. That feels like something you could see today. In 1891, people wanted to see the clothes George Washington wore, or to read the journals and the diaries that he wrote. That was true in 1890, that was true in 1790, it's certainly true today, and I thank the National Archives for their essential role in that conversation. So, author-in-chief. I started working on this, believe it or not, back in 2008. I was in grad school at that time at Yale, as they mentioned. But what I was really doing is going to Politico's website way too often and clicking refresh because it was such an exciting presidential election. I'm sure a lot of you have memories of following that election too. And I couldn't help but notice that Barack Obama's book, John McCain's book, they were at the center of that election. Voters were really responding to them. And I guess it just made me curious. I thought, has this ever happened before? Or is this the first time a presidential book has been this important or not? And it turned out that it's a very deep and fascinating history. The first campaign book by a president was written by Thomas Jefferson. The first presidential memoir written by a president was by John Adams. So the history of presidents and their books is as old as the history of America itself. And I knew it was a history that I wanted to dig into because nobody had told this story before. I quickly realized in the 10 years I spent working on this that it was a much more complicated history than you might expect. The best way to show this, and I remember a big epiphany for me while I was working on my research, is this letter from Abraham Lincoln. I have to step back and give a little bit of context here. It's 1859. Abraham Lincoln knows he wants to run for president, so he writes what's called an autobiographical sketch. So it's just 2 or 3 pages that sort of sums up his life story. And I would encourage you to read it. You can find it online. It's such a charming document. It makes you like Lincoln. It makes you trust Lincoln. It's the best advertisement he could make for himself as a political candidate. And yet, when he sent this autobiographical sketch around to journalists, he included a cover letter. And in that cover letter, he said, "Of course, it must not appear to have been written by myself." Now stop and think about that for a second. That's the complete opposite of how things work today, right? Lincoln wrote a brilliant document that would help him become president, and then he said, make sure my name's on it. Make sure nobody knows that I had anything to do with it. Today we have people who run for presidents who produce books that they don't write, but then they do make sure their names appear on it. It's a complete inversion. But it's a fascinating inversion, and there are big social forces that explain that. There are things like authorship. For a long time in America, you didn't want to be known as an author. That was seen as very arrogant. Thomas Jefferson was not known as the author of the Declaration of Independence for decades, because for one individual to claim that credit would have been seen as tacky and too close to monarchy, the very thing that the Declaration tried to sever America from. The same thing was true for running for president. When you ran for president in most of the 19th century and certainly in the 18th century, you didn't go out there and shake hands and kiss babies and give speeches. That was seen as not something that a true civic servant would do. Instead, you let other people do that campaigning for you, and you sort of just preserved the appearance of being a dignified statesman. So those kinds of big social forces are why Lincoln had to attach this to his writing, why he couldn't get credit for how good of a writer that he was. And this is an example of that how personal is history question I mentioned, because there are so many social forces that shape history. There's authorship, there's running for president, there's much bigger ones like racism or sexism or technology, and historians are always trying to decide how much of this thing that happened is because an individual did something bold, or how much of it was an individual shaped by the social forces around them. So how personal is history? I mean, it really depends on what the historian believes and the call that the historian makes. For what it's worth, a lot of our presidents have been big history readers, and they almost always believe that it comes down to the person. They almost always believe that what makes history is people making choices, not those social forces around them. So, I knew I had a really long story to tell, a story as old as American history itself. I knew I had a really complicated story to tell with ironies and inversions and all kinds of fun twists. So how did I do it? Well, it started by working at a lot of presidential libraries that were mentioned in the introduction. One that I'd like to tell you a little bit about is the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, where I spent a few days. And I just love this picture of John F. Kennedy. I kind of feel like it captures the tone of my book because it's personal, it's lively, it's surprising. And I'm going to give you a little tidbit about this. Kennedy hated typewriters. When he was a college student, he hated typewriters so much that his father hired a typist for him, even while he was a college student, so he didn't have to type up his papers. I think you can notice that he's, right behind a typewriter right now, and that's because it's a promotional photo. When his first book, Why England Slept, came out, the person who wouldn't deign to touch a typewriter was happy to slide behind one and smile for the cameras. So, an interesting tidbit, but also very revealing, I think, and humanizing photo. So, at the Kennedy Presidential Library, and I'll just explain quickly how this works. The archivists in the room obviously know this better than I do, but for people who've never gotten the chance to do this sort of research, most of the important documents are in these big boxes. You can see some of them kind of in the background there. Up front is a label of a box of Joseph P. Kennedy's papers, Kennedy's father. And so archivists have generally gone through the documents, tried to look at every one, organized them by year or by the person who sent a letter or the person who wrote a document, and then they organize them in, Kennedy was senator in this time, Kennedy was a representative in this time. So they're big categories. But then if you want to go through it, you request these boxes, and you can see in the background how many boxes I had requested that day, because you have to go through thousands of pages sometimes to find the one page that really unlocks history for you. But there were all of these boxes, and I would go through them. There's one more wrinkle you should know about at the Kennedy Presidential Library, though, which is that anything with Kennedy's handwriting in it, even researchers who are credentialed aren't allowed to use. They actually keep those in a safe, and they preserve photocopies for people to look at to protect the documents with Kennedy's handwriting. That's worth knowing because, again and again, when I was working on my book, I would go through folders and I would find examples of Kennedy's handwriting. And I started to get sheepish about it, honestly, because I would have to raise my hand and an archivist would come over and I would say, sorry, I found another example of Kennedy's handwriting that you guys missed. And the reason for that is not because I was doing anything brilliant or special, it's because I had a really specific question. I wasn't interested in Kennedy's presidency. That's a huge topic. So many books have been written about that. I was interested in Kennedy as an author. And so I was looking at speeches and looking at letters and looking at documents that archivists and historians hadn't really studied closely. That's how I kept finding his handwriting. That's how I kept raising my hand and having archivists come over and say, you're not supposed to see that, finish up, but then we'll make sure that goes back in the safe. But asking that really specific question for Kennedy and the other people, it enabled me to find so many new stories that even if you read all those big biographies of Kennedy, you will find so much material in my book that you haven't seen before. Here's an example of that, and one of the kind of big aha moments for me in my research. Kennedy wrote Profiles in Courage, but I think most people know that he didn't write it the way that I wrote my book or the way most authors write their book. He had a lot of help on it. I sort of detail exactly how that relationship with his aide, Ted Sorensen, worked in the book. But what really interested me was not that Kennedy didn't write his book, but that he was so obsessed with promoting it. He really wanted literary fame, even though he wasn't always willing to do literary work. And that's kind of the story I tell in my chapter. Why did this matter so much to him? Why did the approval of authors like Philip Roth really matter to somebody like John F. Kennedy? And the detail that really surprised me and is so important to the book is this letter right here. Kennedy won a Pulitzer for Profiles in Courage. And other biographers have talked about that and said, oh, his dad got it for him. But that's not true. I found a letter here from John F. Kennedy to his father that shows that Kennedy was personally involved in getting the Pulitzer Prize for him. I found other examples of Kennedy's just real desire to have a Pulitzer Prize. Even though it didn't help him politically, honestly, it probably hurt him politically because that's what opened up the ghostwriting scandal. But again, by asking those kinds of specific questions, you can find new documents, and I think those new documents can really tell us something about the presidents as people. Another way I did my research, and I was fortunate in this, in that these kinds of technologies have only become robust in the last few years, is I used online databases. So this sort of looks, like Google. It's like a search box. But what it searches, and there are a lot of databases like this, is old newspapers which have been scanned. And so there are thousands of newspapers, millions of pages, small towns, big magazines, everything. And the technology isn't perfect, but it works pretty well, especially if you have a very specific search. Like I could search Kennedy plus profiles from 1956 to 1960. And that let me find so many fun and new documents. This is a story from the newspaper in Long Beach, California. And the picture doesn't reproduce very well, unfortunately, because of the scans, but it's a picture of Ronald Reagan with his first book, Where's the Rest of Me? That's a book that even Ronald Reagan fans may not have heard of. It's been kind of forgotten, but it was a huge bestseller in its day, and Ronald Reagan wrote it right before he ran for governor, and he did these book signings like this one. You can see him with the pen getting ready to inscribe a book right before he ran for governor. And there were so many details in it that were fascinating. The other thing that this kind of work did, both the archival work and then looking at old newspaper clips, is it set up the third way I would do research, which is to do interviews. So I interviewed this gentleman named Stu Spencer, who was Ronald Reagan's campaign manager when he ran for governor and when he ran for president. Spencer has been interviewed, I would say, thousands of times about Ronald Reagan. I mean, he's really the go-to source, and at this point, a lot has been written about Ronald Reagan. But when I called Mr. Spencer up, I said, hey, I was reading in an old newspaper about these book signings Reagan did in the 1960s. Do you know anything about that? And he said, no one has ever asked me that question. And then he gave me some wonderful anecdotes from it that really, I think, again, capture the human side of Reagan and sort of reveal something about his politics and about how independent he was. Because Reagan wrote this book before the experts like Stu Spencer showed up. So if it's all right, it's going to be quick, but I'm going to read you a little snippet of my book about the Reagan material I was mentioning, just to give you kind of an example of how the book works. So, Where's the Rest of Me is the book. Nobody knows it today, but it sold hundreds of thousands of copies in 1965, right before Reagan gets ready to run for governor. Early in 1965, Reagan slipped into a ritzy Los Angeles restaurant. He was there to meet Stu Spencer, a political consultant he hoped would join his potential campaign for governor. It was an interview for Reagan as much as for Spencer. The consultant was worried about the actor's right-wing reputation, but found him to be smart, funny, and restrained. Spencer agreed to help Reagan explore a run for governor, though the candidate had one more surprise. I wrote a book, Reagan said. It's going to come out this spring. How's that going to fit? Rather nicely, it turned out. Spencer wanted Reagan to meet more voters, and book signings provided the perfect cover. The consultant checked in on an early one at a Los Angeles bookstore, where Reagan arrived straight from his horse ranch. This is a Spencer quote. He showed up in his English riding gear, breeches, boots, everything but the whip, Spencer remembered. But Reagan still charmed the crowd, signing books and chatting with aspiring actors, Illinois transplants, and elderly readers. Reagan did events for Where's the Rest of Me all over California, San Francisco, Irvine, Long Beach. He was still in leading man shape, just over 6 feet tall with dark brown hair and hazel eyes, and he was a natural at retail politics. That year, Spencer scheduled dozens of speaking engagements for Reagan, including more book signings. At one of those signings, a reporter asked Reagan whether he'd found the rest of him. I found it, Reagan replied, in politics. So, those are kind of the methods that I used to work on the book, and I thought I would share some of the kind of big picture takeaways. What are the big lessons I learned after 10 years of thinking about this material and sifting through this material? One is that these campaign books and these presidential memoirs have made an enormous impact on American history, even if we've sort of forgotten that impact today. It's easy to dismiss these books sometimes, but again and again, I found examples of these books just being essential to American elections or to understanding American presidents. They were big bestsellers. They were books that were the popular culture of their time, and people were obsessed with reading them, talking about them, understanding them. A great example is this portrait of John Adams. That book next to him, that's Thomas Jefferson's book. That's Notes on the State of Virginia. A little bit of a different title on the spine, but that was Jefferson's book because Jefferson's book was everywhere. If you adjust the sales totals of Thomas Jefferson's book in his era to our population today, Notes on the State of Virginia sold the equivalent of 500,000 copies. And that's a big number today, but that's a really big number when you think about the differences in printing technology and transporting books and all the things that made Jefferson's era different from our own. These books were at the heart of American history, and presidents read other presidents. Adams read Jefferson. Reagan read Coolidge. Grant read Lincoln. There are so many stories of these books just being right at the heart of American culture. I also think, though, that looking at presidents and their books really reveals a human side of our presidents, and that's something I want to show you through a John Adams quote. John Adams, as I mentioned earlier, wrote his presidential memoir. He wrote more than 400 pages and gave up because he was just frustrated. And one of his friends said, well, why did you give up? This is what Adams said. You advised me to write my own life. I've made several attempts, but it is so dull an employment that I cannot endure it. I look so much like a small boy in my own eyes that with all my vanity, I cannot endure the sight of the picture. How honest is that? That's more honest than anything that's in John Adams' autobiography, but that's there's something about the act of writing, and we all know this. It involves, whether you're writing an email or a Facebook post or a book, there's something about writing that forces you to slow down. It forces you to open yourself up. It forces you to think, what am I scared of? What am I passionate about? What am I ambitious about? And that's true for presidents, just like it's true for all of us. Again and again, when I was looking at these books and the behind-the-scenes stories, I found those kinds of human moments. The third thing I found is actually something about people like you, about readers. It kind of makes sense. If these books were big bestsellers, if they were central to American culture, well, why is that? It's because American readers really, really cared about them. And I actually try to tell some stories of those readers in my book. One thing I hope my book does is tell serious readers the history of themselves, whether it's stories about bookstores or story about readers going to libraries. What did it feel like to walk into a bookstore in the 19th century? If you read my book, you'll get the answer to that, because it was really important for me to sort of write a book that book lovers could see themselves in. And this is one of the regular readers I write about. This is somebody named James Carruthers. He was an African-American man who grew up in Michigan. And if you look at that picture, you see his coat doesn't fit very well. That's because he didn't have a lot of money. That's his grandfather's coat. His grandfather raised him. And what they had to do was take the grandfather's clothes and, at home tailor them so they would fit James Carruthers, because they didn't have money to do anything else. But what Carruthers did do, by borrowing books from school or going to libraries or asking friends, what he did do is read. He wrote about this later in his life, and he said that he read books to, quote, learn about the careers of American public men. I labored at self-improvement. I still recall the delight I found. I found so many examples of readers like Carruthers, and this may be something that resonates with you and why you like to read as well. This desire to read practical books, to read books for self-improvement, to read books to learn about the presidents or to learn about people who are running for president. That's not something that's new. That's something that's been part of America's DNA from the very beginning, and I really tried to honor that tradition and to represent it in my book. So those are the kind of, the 10,000-foot takeaways from my book, I think. In the last time that I've got, I would like to tell you one story, sort of walk you through one example of a chapter, so you can get kind of a taste for it, because, the book just came out yesterday, so certainly not many people have had a chance to read it. But I'll walk through the Lincoln chapter, and then after that, we can talk a little bit about, if you've read a favorite presidential book or your favorite presidents. I'd be happy to take questions on whatever you'd like. So, Lincoln. I think we all know, this is of course from the famous John Ford film, we all know and love that Lincoln was a reader, right? He grew up on the frontier in Indiana. I'll be honest, that's part of the reason I picked Lincoln to talk about. It's a little bit of Midwestern bias from me. It's my book. If I want to talk about Indiana, I'm going to talk about Indiana. But we all love Lincoln, right? We all know that he loved books, that books really mattered to him, even though he grew up on the frontier in a place where books were hard to come by. But what many people do not know, what I certainly didn't know before I started working on this, is that Lincoln was the very first presidential candidate to put together a book of his own words. That book was called Political Debates Between the Honorable Abraham Lincoln and the Honorable Stephen Douglas. And I'd like to sort of explain to you the story behind that book, because I think it tells something about Lincoln and about the kind of person he was. So the story starts in 1858. The book comes out in 1860 and is very important for Lincoln's run for the presidency. But it starts in 1858. Lincoln had just had his big Senate race against Stephen Douglas. Lincoln had lost. But during the course of that Senate race, they had these famous debates. And these debates, I talk about it a little bit in the book, they were kind of like outdoor carnivals. They were, today we think of them as scholarly and stuffy, but at the time they were rowdy, and there were big debates, but there were also big issues, this idea of slavery and whether or not it should expand. And so Lincoln, everybody else said, okay, we've had the debates, it's time to move on. There's a presidential election coming in 2 years, that's old news. Lincoln didn't think that. Lincoln thought, what if I preserve the transcripts of these debates? Because this was a new innovation. Remember, we talked about how personal is history and how there are social forces like technology. One of those social forces, one of those changes is that journalism was changing. And so newspapers were starting to send stenographers who would use shorthand to transcribe the debates and then print the debates so people who couldn't attend could read the debates in print. Well, everybody just kind of got rid of those newspapers, just like we would today. But of course, they didn't have Google or electronic archives to find something later. But Lincoln thought, there's something worth preserving here. So that's why he wrote letters to track down those transcripts. This is one example where he says, I wish to preserve a set of the late debates. But he wrote at least 9, or received at least 9 letters about this in the weeks after he lost the Senate race. And I really want you guys to take away how obsessed Lincoln was with this idea. It mattered to him so much. he sent this letter to somebody in Chicago trying to get those transcripts. When he didn't hear from that person, he sent another letter to another person in Chicago. It had been a week. I mean, the letter had barely gotten there, but this mattered so much to Lincoln that he's following up. He's trying to track down those transcripts because he believed those transcripts had an important purpose. So the next step for Lincoln was to put together a scrapbook. He eventually got all these different newspaper transcripts, and he put them together in a really careful way. He had multiple copies of newspapers, so he would go through, and if one newspaper got a paragraph wrong, he would cut out that newspaper and slide in the other one there. You can see that there. You can see his handwriting. You can see little edits that he made to correct words. He was very careful to be fair, to make sure that Douglas's speeches looked as good as Lincoln's did, and Lincoln's looked as good as Douglas's did. But he put together this scrapbook. And then, it's a long story I get into in the book, but eventually, after a couple tries, Lincoln found a printer to print this book to have it come out in 1860. So, social forces, how personal is history? A big reason that Lincoln's book mattered and that Lincoln's book succeeded was actually technology. By the time Lincoln ran for president, there were, of course, trains in America. And trains are a much better way, with their steam-powered engines, to transport books from one spot to another than, a wagon pulled by horses. That helped Lincoln's book become a bestseller. But even printing presses were changing at this time. I love this picture because it's a printing press that's powered by a steam engine. So steam engines are changing transportation, they're changing printing as well, and that made books more affordable. That made it easier for Lincoln's book to reach lots and lots of voters. And it absolutely did. That headline up there ran in a newspaper in 1860, and I love it because, read it carefully, the speeches of Stephen A. Douglas and the speeches of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was still not a national figure. Reporters couldn't even get his name right, even though it's right there in the front of the book that they're writing about. But they could get his book, and they could read his words, and they could study his words. And that's exactly what started to happen before the Republican convention and even more after Lincoln was nominated. Here's a newspaper, one of those small newspapers I found with those databases. In Illinois, this book should be in the hands of every voter. And honestly, if you go back and read those newspapers and that early coverage, it felt like it was in the hands of every voter. This book was right at the heart of this pivotal election in 1860. An example I love is this bookstore in Chicago. It was called S.C. Griggs & Company. Of course, it's closed down long ago, but it was so big that people called it the Literary Emporium of the Prairie. One day, the staff there set out a stack of Lincoln's books that was 7 feet tall, even taller than Lincoln in his top hat, right? Just a huge stack of books. By the end of the day, that stack is gone, and they've had to send and order more books. That's because so many people were buying this book, and it was so essential. The book ended up selling 50,000 copies by Election Day, and if you adjust for population, that's the equivalent of 500,000 copies in today's market. So let's go back to this question of how personal is history. How was Lincoln able to be the first person to do this, the first person running for president? How was he able to say, you know what would be great? You know what would help me? A book. A book that has my words, that can present my words straight to voters. That's the ticket to me winning the White House. Nobody else had imagined that. I mean, it's even more than that. Lincoln himself had said, his own writing must not appear to have been written by myself. And he did not get credit for the book about his debates. It wasn't like people said, oh, Lincoln put together this book. It was just that Lincoln put it together because he believed in it. So why? Well, I think one part of the answer is pretty obvious. Lincoln was a book lover, right? A letter that he wrote when he finally found out somebody would publish the political debates book, I think is a really striking quote. He said, I esteem the compliment paid to me in this manner as the very highest I have ever received. So I guess we can't say that it mattered to him more than becoming president because he hadn't become president yet, but up to that point in his life, the biggest compliment Abraham Lincoln had ever received was that somebody was willing to publish his book. That's how much his book mattered to him. This is a picture from inside Lincoln's house in Springfield, Illinois. Maybe some of you have visited it before. And we know from reporting at that time period that when Lincoln got his complimentary copies of the book, he lined the walls of this room with his book. So there were stacks everywhere. I kind of think about Mary Todd and his kids having to deal with books everywhere, but that's how it had to be. But his books were everywhere. When voters would come up to him and say, what do you think about this? He would say, go look at the book. The book will give you the answer. Part of the reason Lincoln was able to do that, I think, is just because he was a book lover and that meant something to him. But I actually think there's a little bit more to it, and it's something that gets a little bit more at Lincoln's heart and mind. The reason I say this is this lecture that he gave called Lecture on Discoveries and Inventions. It's kind of a minor hit in the Lincoln canon, but It's a great speech. I really would recommend that everybody go out and read it. Lincoln sort of talks about, what have been the most important technologies in global history, not just American history. So, like iron tools or the telegraph. What are the technologies that really made a difference for human civilization? And it's a pretty scholarly, wonky kind of lecture. It's a little bit aloof. But when I was reading it, when Lincoln got to talking about printing, the tone changed. I could just feel it. It just became more personal. And I realized something. Do you remember that autobiographical sketch? I realized that Lincoln was using the same ideas he had used when he talked about his own upbringing in southern Indiana and applying those to the lecture to talk about why printing mattered. So, here's something from the sketch. No qualification was ever required of a teacher beyond reading, writing, and ciphering. So that's Lincoln talking about the area that he grew up in. Now, in the lecture, when he's talking about the world before print, why did print change everything? What was it like before print? Here's what he says in the lecture. The teachers were not very numerous or very competent. It's the same idea, right? Let's have another example. In the sketch, Lincoln, talking about southern Indiana. If a straggler supposed to understand Latin happened to sojourn in the neighborhood, he was looked upon as a wizard. See, I told you it was charming, right? That's just pure Lincoln to talk about his background that way. Okay, so let's go back to the lecture where Lincoln is talking about what was the world like before print. They looked upon the educated few as superior beings. Again, it's the exact same idea. And when Lincoln kind of finally makes his case for printing and why it matters in his lecture, this is what he says. To emancipate the mind is the great task which printing came into the world to perform. Look at those words. Emancipate. That is not a metaphor that Lincoln would choose lightly. That's not the first word that comes to his mind. That is an important and controversial metaphor when he's working on this lecture in the 1850s. And I think it speaks to how important print was to Lincoln. Lincoln was an evangelical believer in the power of print. To him, books could change the world. Books changed his world. And because of that, I believe that's why he worked so hard to bring out the book of his own. So, one more question, one more version of this, how personal is history? How was I able to make these connections? Honestly, if you go, probably a lot of you have read Lincoln biographies, and so the story of his book is not in them. The story of his belief in print and how he saw the world in this way is not in them. How was I able to make those connections? This is the house I grew up in southern Indiana. It's not a log cabin, but it is a farm. My family grew up there and lived there for 4 generations. And when I read Lincoln talking about, growing up without books, then getting books, feeling like people didn't understand him, feeling like books could change the way he lived and the things that he was exposed to, I didn't need Lincoln to explain that to me. I knew that. I grew up with that myself. And so how personal is history? I think history is not just personal in terms of people changing history. I think history is personal in terms of historians writing about history. And because of my personal experience, I think I was able to see something in Lincoln's story that other people haven't seen. I want to offer one more example of this, though. History is also personal in terms of readers. If I did my job writing my book, you will find things in it, you will make connections in it that I never noticed because you will bring your experiences to bear on it. History is personal in terms of the people who change history. History is personal in terms of the people who write history, and history is personal in terms of the people who read history. And so for that reason, let's aspire to be Lincoln. Let's love books like Lincoln. Let's have the moral certainty of Lincoln. But let's not forget about readers like James Carruthers either, because his belief that it is important to read about America's leaders and to read about them for self-improvement, that's just as much a part of the American story as Lincoln's. Thank you so much. So do we have time for questions? All right, there are microphones over here, and it's important to use the microphones because that will help with the closed captioning that's happening. So I'd love to talk about anything you guys want to hear, and thanks again for coming. Hi there.
Great. Hi, how are you doing? Thank you very much for the talk today and the background and the history. I'm just curious from the perspective of the people that you focused on, the presidents and their books, what were the inspirations for them for a young country like this? Were they looking back at similar, I don't know if you looked at that from Europe, were the things you were talking about, publications and print coming from there? Is there any connection there in regards to the focus for what they said, hey, this person wrote a book, I can do it too, or anything like that?
Sure. That's a wonderful question. I'm so glad you raised it. I can answer, in my book I sort of talk about campaign books, and I talk about what I call legacy books, books written after the White House. The campaign books question is easy to answer. That's something that was invented in America. That's something that you will see in other countries today. You know, in Australia, people who are running for political office there will write books, but that started right here in America. So that's easy to answer. Autobiographies is a little bit more complicated because there's, of course, a really long tradition of autobiographical writing going back to the Greeks. But what I can tell you is that, yes, the founders studied those books. John Adams, I went through his library and working in documents that were preserved by the National Archives, actually, and studied, you know, how many autobiographies did he own? How many of these books did he read? And the answer was a lot of them. So there was a tradition of autobiography. That said, it really took off in America in a different way. One of the most surprising things to me about my book is that 4 out of the 5 first presidents in America tried to write their own autobiographies. All of them did except for Washington. He was the only one who didn't want anything to do with it. So 4 out of the 5, if you compare that to the British prime ministers in this period, there's no comparison. So there really is something about autobiography and political autobiography that thrived in America. And I think there's a lot of explanations for it, kind of in those social forces way that we were talking about. You know, the presidency puts a real emphasis on the individual. The way that America expanded the electorate puts real emphasis on the individual. So individuals are really something that we think about in America, which makes sense that autobiographies would be something that we want to read. But I mean, there's also a personal angle to it too. One of the autobiographies John Adams owned was by Edward Gibbon, the famous historian. And when Gibbon wrote about his personal life, he said, you know, I'm not going to talk about this because the people I dated and the people I was in love with, that belongs to science, not autobiography. Which makes no sense. I mean, I guess it kind of does make sense today, but it makes no sense in terms of writing and reading because those autobiographies, I mean, those are personal details. Now compare that to John Adams, who, yes, was inspired by books like Gibbon's, but when John Adams writes, he says, I want my kids to know that they don't have to worry about any brothers or sisters floating around. You know, I'm not like Franklin, I'm not like Jefferson, I kept my nose clean. That's a personal thing. Like, that's John Adams being somebody who overshares, frankly, and being somebody who's really emotional. And that you can see that kind of difference there. But I hope that's a partial answer to sort of how they drew inspirations, but also how, especially with campaign books, it's something that's special to America. Thank you.
First of all, happy Lincoln's birthday. So just the other day, 2 days ago, I finished reading Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on Lyndon Johnson, The American Dream.
Sure.
And she talks about the difficulty. She was brought to the ranch after he retired to work with him on his biography, and he would become so stilted. And so I didn't know if you had anything to share. The book was only published yesterday. I haven't read it yet.
Totally fine.
About that and Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, I actually interviewed a couple. I didn't interview Doris because I'd read what she'd written about it in that book, but I interviewed a couple other ghostwriters in that. And it's really an example, I guess, of those kinds of social forces, because they would sit down and Johnson would dictate. They would they went through his archives. They said, okay, well, what if you tell a story about this? What if you tell a story about this? And he would tell the most amazing stories. And, they were full of profanities. He would do impressions of other people. It was just pure Lyndon Johnson. So they would write it up. They would be so excited. They would go to their office, write it up, turn it into a narrative that would work in book format, bring it back to him, and he would say, no, that's not presidential. That's the word he would use, presidential. That's like kind of this understanding of what should presidents be, how stately should they be. And so when I talked to one of the ghostwriters, he said, honestly, we would write these amazing chapters. He would say no, so I quit trying. After a couple tries, I realized that he didn't want any of the personality, any of those private moments getting into the book, so I just stopped. The Lyndon Johnson archive still has some of the earlier transcripts, so we can see a couple glimpses of what that book might have been like, and I think it would have been a more authentic book, certainly a more fun book to read. But unfortunately, even a writer as good as Doris Kearns Goodwin and the other ghostwriters who were working on it couldn't get a great book out of Johnson because Johnson didn't want a great book to be written. Thank you for the question.
Hi. Is there a correlation between the number of copies sold and their success in getting elected?
I didn't break it down mathematically because I don't think there would have been a big enough sample size, but definitely you could see that as people became more successful, books would kind of be a way to track their popularity. Calvin Coolidge is a really good example. When he was running for president, and he was not chosen as the president, but his book helped him become vice president, after which he became president. But he had a really important book called Have Faith in Massachusetts. And the book was the campaign. Like, we think about Silent Cal, if we think about Coolidge at all, honestly. We should. He's kind of the unwritten star of this book. He wrote 2 really good books. But Coolidge was silent in public, because he knew that he had this book that was being distributed. And the better that Coolidge did, the more copies that were printed, and the more the book took off. And it kind of surprised his supporters. One of the people who really helped Coolidge run was kind of an industry tycoon in Boston. And he used some of his personal connections within the industry to get more paper, because there was more demand for these books. They were skyrocketing as interest in Coolidge skyrocketed, sort of an answer to your question. And so he had to go and talk, magnet to magnet to get that kind of paper supply to be able to meet the demand. So it would be wonderful if I could graph it out or something like that, but I can't quite do that. But I can show that, as they became more popular, as interest surged, books were often one of the best metrics to measure that. Thank you for your question. Hi there.
Hi. U.S. Grant?
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that his autobiography is great literature, and you never said anything about how would you compare his as great literature?
Sure. So there's a whole chapter on Grant in the book, and it's because his autobiography is great literature. It's a wonderful book to read. I will say that it often gets called the best presidential memoir, and I think that's misleading because it's really a book of military history. It focuses on his time in the Civil War and a little bit on his life before that. But it's a wonderfully written book, and what makes it tragic and poignant and even more moving is that he was dying of cancer as he was writing this book. He had 2 tragedies hit him. He had a bankruptcy hit him late in life, and he had throat cancer hit him late in life. He had refused to write a book up to that point, but I think realizing that his death was approaching and realizing that he had nothing to leave his family in terms of his finances, he decided to write a book because that could address both of those concerns. And in my book, I include, from the National Archives, a page of Grant first starting to work on this book. And I reproduced the page because you can see his pen marks. You can see him crossing out lines. You can see him stopping sentences mid-sentence. He didn't know how to be a writer yet. He hadn't figured it out. But the more he did it, the more he put himself into it, he really did learn how to be a good writer. And I think one of the secrets for why he was such a good writer was actually because he was a good reader. Grant loved novels. He was really the first American president to just be a full-blown fiction fanatic. He got demerits at West Point because he was reading too many novels in the library instead of doing the things that he was supposed to do as a cadet. And, the books you read shape the person that you are. And my favorite passages in Grant's memoirs, the ones that I would elevate to the rank of literature, are his descriptions of other people. When he describes meeting Lincoln or when he describes meeting Robert E. Lee. What are novelists good at? Novelists are good at character, right? They describe other characters really well. And I think Grant, because of a life of reading novels, was able to describe other people in a really effective way. Thank you for your question. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming out. I really appreciated it. This is my first chance to talk about the book, so you all were a very friendly and very kind first audience, and I think copies of the book are going to be for sale, and I'm outside, and I'm also happy to sign them or to talk more with you personally about presidents and their books. Thank you again for coming out.